All right. Sorry, everyone. I just said 80% of the time I get the sound with the music completely wrong, and that is the case here. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Katya Wald. I'm the Executive Director here at the MIT Enterprise Forum. We're really excited about this event today on Canada's clean hydrogen strategy. I know we don't have a whole lot of time, so I want to keep my introductions brief. And just say thank you all for coming. Thank you to Canada for being a long-time supporter of what we do here at the MIT Enterprise Forum, Cambridge. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Andrew, who's going to say a few words.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Katja. Again, the Consul General of Canada in Boston's excited to continue partnering with MIT's Enterprise Forum and to bring you today's program. 2021 is a critical year for climate action, and countries need to come forward with higher levels of ambition for reducing emissions if we want to keep global warming to an average of 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was great to hear last week that Canada announced a significant increase in its ambition, raising our targets from 30% to 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. And we know that it will take a whole of country approach with many solutions and different avenues utilized. And clean hydrogen is one of these. Back in December, Canada introduced its hydrogen strategy. And I was lucky enough to be introduced to many of the panelists today who contributed to that strategy. And I think that there's a great opportunity to look at that and to use that as a component to combat climate change. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ella Fetter, who is a proud Canadian herself and a senior producer at one of my favorite programs in any medium, NPR's Science Friday. I think many of us probably know Science Friday. So I'm going to turn it over to Ella and let her take it from here.
I actually have to correct that. We are not with NPR anymore. We are now distributed by WNYC, but very commonly, we play on NPR stations, so it's a very common misapprehension. But yeah, thank you for the welcome. Hello, everyone. So I guess I will just start by getting each of the panelists to introduce themselves. Maybe each of you can tell us a bit about yourselves and also how you first got interested in hydrogen. David, I'll start with you.
Sure. David Lazell. I'm a professor at the University of Calgary, where I run the Canadian Energy Systems Analysis Research Initiative. And I'm also one of the founders and actually the energy system architect with the Transition Accelerator, a not-for-profit across Canada. I've been interested in hydrogen for my whole career, mostly in the early stages as hydrogen as it was being produced by plants. I'm a plant biologist by trade, but then became more interested in the implications of hydrogen as an energy carrier for to help us address the climate change issue. So. And for the last 20 years, I've been looking at real focus on finding climate change solutions. And hydrogen has come to, in my mind, as one of the top opportunities, I think, for getting us to where we need to go.
Emery Genscher, you are next in my tile arrangement, so I'll get you to go next.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I am Emre Gencer. I am a research scientist at MIT Energy Initiative, and I am leading the research and analysis group in MIT. My background is in chemical engineering, and currently my research is looking at the energy transition questions about how we can decarbonize the energy system using different options like electricity as well as hydrogen. And my interest really started during my PhD, where I was looking at how we can benefit from solar energy to the maximum possible. And like production of hydrogen, one of the promising paths that we've seen. And since then, for the last more than 10 years, I'm working on hydrogen-related topics.
Thank you. Keegan?
Hey, my name is Keegan Tully. I'm a director of business development at Ontario Power Generation. And, you know, I think my team looks at developing new business opportunities for the company related to electrification, which which we would call, EV charging, but also hydrogen. And it's something that we've been monitoring for quite some time. And I think with the release of the Canadian Federal Hydrogen Strategy and Ontario, the province where we operate, discussion paper on hydrogen, we're just seeing the prospects accelerate. And so that's really where I've become involved with hydrogen.
Mike, you're up.
Great. Hi, I'm Mike Kelland. I'm the CEO of Planetary Hydrogen. So we're a startup out of Canada based on the east coast of Canada in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. And we are bringing to market a technology that produces hydrogen at the same time as taking carbon dioxide directly out of the air and storing it as basically it turns it into an antacid for the ocean. So it stores it in ocean chemistry. My interest in hydrogen is relatively recent, I think, compared to everybody else here. I started this company with Dr. Greg Rao, who had been working on the technology for a really long time out of California. And we were looking for a high impact climate solution. And this one really checked all the boxes for us. So I've been getting up to speed over the last year and a half on hydrogen. My background is in software, so this is new for me. But I've been learning as fast as I can. And I really think that hydrogen is a really interesting energy carrier for clean transition and for deep decarbonization. But I also think that there's a lot of opportunity to decarbonize the existing hydrogen market, which is absolutely massive as well. So there's, I think, a huge range of opportunities within hydrogen that I'm really interested in.
We are definitely going to ask you more about your technology during this conversation. I just wanted to echo what Katya said. Everybody who is in attendance, you can ask questions throughout. I think we have both a chat and a Q&A. I'm kind of loosely looking at it, and I'll try to get to your questions. If I don't get to them, we'll try to get to them at the end in a Q&A. But please feel free to pipe in at any time. So to get started, we're not going to assume any level of knowledge in our audience members, although I have a feeling quite a few of them know a lot about this. David, can you give us a primer for people who don't know anything about hydrogen and what it has to do with energy and decarbonization? What are we talking about here?
Well, hydrogen is actually made up of two atoms. The most predominant atoms in the universe. I think 75% of all atoms in the universe is hydrogen, H2 protons, essentially. Put two of them together, there's a lot of energy in that bond. And the beauty of it is when you break that bond by burning it or putting it through a fuel cell, it produces only water as an emission. So essentially it does not produce a greenhouse gas. And that makes it a zero emission energy carrier. And the problem we have on climate change is about 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions in Canada are associated with the production and use of carbon-based energy carriers. Essentially gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, natural gas. And it's pretty clear if we're going to get to net zero emissions by 2050, we need to replace those energy carriers. You can do it with electricity. You can use electricity made from carbon-free sources as one way of moving to a net zero energy system. But many of our industrial processes and many of our energy needs require a chemically based energy carrier. And hydrogen is a chemically based energy carrier that we can use without creating greenhouse gas emissions. So, and I think around the world, there's a recognition when we started talking about really net zero in the next 30 years, which has only happened in the last 3 or 4 years, it was hydrogen came to the fore as being, this is a key pillar in the solution. So that's why we're interested in it.
Just the nitty gritty here. How does hydrogen work as an energy carrier? Maybe Emery, maybe you can explain that. Like, you don't need to get too far into the weeds, but what's the principle here? Hydrogen is a gas. What makes it an energy carrier, and how do we use it?
Yeah, basically the chemical bond makes as an energy carrier. So you have two hydrogen atoms and you have chemical bond between these, in which you are actually storing the energy. And this is true for any fuels. Basically, when you have carbonaceous material like gasoline, diesel, and others, you have bonds between carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, as well as carbon-carbon bonds. And we have the same principle here. But I think the main question is how we can get out this chemical energy. So, and that we have multiple ways of using it. So one is fuel cells, in which we are running this through a reactor where we can directly generate electrons, which can be directly used as electricity, or like in other engines, for example, we can combust hydrogen. And when we combust, we are only producing water vapor. And from this heat, we can generate electricity, or we can use as heat. So this is the main mechanism how we can use hydrogen. But there's one more very important piece is actually we can also use hydrogen to upgrade, for example, biofuels. So this is also another like third very important use option for hydrogen.
So this is actually a very old idea. I've been seeing this Jules Verne quote everywhere about, well, I think I have it, and I hope this is not the internet botching a quote, but that in his book, The Mysterious Island, he wrote, "Water will one day be employed as fuel, that hydrogen and oxygen which constitute it, used singly or together, will furnish an inexhaustible source of heat and light of an intensity of which coal is not capable." So this has been, an idea that we've had for a very, very long time. We're already producing a hydrogen, but how far along are we? Keegan, you've talked about this being something that OPG is monitoring. Where are we at right now in terms of this becoming a reality, in terms of using hydrogen as an actual energy carrier?
Yeah, I think the technologies to use it are out there, right? Fuel cells that Emma was talking about. So there is lots of opportunity. I don't think it's super plentiful, but it is in more places than you would imagine. It's a key part of the petrochemical industry, refining, and generally it's produced from natural gas. So in our province in Ontario, there is a large use for hydrogen, but it's produced from natural gas. And so most of the emerging interest is in, clean hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen. So either produced from electricity or with carbon capture produced from natural gas. And so I think the new use cases are emerging, right? It's those industries that rely on a chemical fuel, long haul trucking that can't electrify using battery electric vehicles. I think these use cases are going to be where hydrogen fits in, and they're not. People aren't switching immediately, I would say, in rapid numbers, but it's essential to meet these 2050 targets. And so if we want to get there, we got to start now, I think, is the point. And that's why OPG is starting to work on this. With action from government. Our company is committed to net zero by 2040. We're going to need these solutions, and we have to start preparing now if we're going to meet those targets.
So I think this is a really important point to underline for anyone who is new to hydrogen. Not all hydrogen is created equal. When you use up hydrogen, you burn it or you use it in a fuel cell, it's true that it's zero carbon emissions, you're just producing water, but you have to it's an energy carrier ultimately. You have to use energy to produce it. And you can use all kinds of different sources for that. Right now, I believe we're still mostly using natural gas to produce our, I think I read like 3/4 of the hydrogen in the world is produced by natural gas. Mike, I wanted to talk to you. We'll get to your specific technology because you you're aiming to produce the greenest of hydrogen.
The greenest of green.
The greenest of green. But you actually don't really like these color terms that we've been using, if I understood. So first of all, for the uninitiated, what do people mean when they say blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen, green hydrogen, and why do you want to move away from that?
Well, so this actually comes back to the Canada's National Hydrogen Strategy, and this is something that I think is central to the discussion inside the strategy, which is that the colors are getting really confusing. So hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. There's an awful lot of it out there, and as such, there's an awful lot of ways to make it. And so the two predominant ones, the ones that we talk about a lot, we term them, or the three, I should say, because in clean hydrogen we talk about two, but in general we talk about three. Gray hydrogen is considered dirty hydrogen in terms of it produces a lot of carbon in the life cycle of producing it, and it comes from just about any fossil fuel. So you can produce hydrogen from coal or from natural gas or from other things. The last stat I read said that something like 95% of hydrogen produced today, and it's a $150 billion market today, so it's not a small market, but about 95% of it is produced using in the gray sort of category. And as you said, most of it's from natural gas, but not all of it, and it can be worse than natural gas, in fact, in terms of its carbon intensity. To give you a sense of it, if you were to just take, hydrogen that was produced with natural gas from the gray category and burn that in your car, you'd actually almost be better off burning diesel in terms of the carbon intensity. It's pretty close on a grams of CO2 per energy basis. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can slice that onion, but just to say that it's a pretty dirty fuel source. When we get into blue and green, that's sort of the predominant colors of hydrogen production. Blue hydrogen means natural gas, where we capture the carbon that comes off the process. So when we produce hydrogen from natural gas, essentially how it works is that you blow apart the CH4, which is natural gas, molecule, and you end up with the H as the hydrogen, and the C goes up into the atmosphere. And so that's the carbon dioxide that comes off of it. And it's fairly simple in that, if you think about it that way. And then if we capture that CO2, then we have a much lower carbon intensity for the hydrogen that comes out, and that's considered blue hydrogen. And those systems, typically you'll get to, 85 to 95% of that carbon dioxide that actually ends up getting captured out of that process. So it's pretty clean. Green hydrogen has a different challenge, which is that its life cycle is based on the manufacturing of these big electrolyzers and all these kinds of things. But if you have a green source of energy, then it's basically taking hydrogen and oxygen, and we're splitting that apart in water, and you get, your hydrogen has a fairly low carbon footprint as a result from renewable energy. And then we're hearing all these other colors. I heard the other day yellow for, from nuclear, if you don't consider nuclear to be green power. Purple for biological sources. Somebody was pushing the idea of naming carbon negative hydrogen of all stripes as clear hydrogen. And all these colors get really confusing. But what really matters at the end of the day is, what is the carbon intensity of the hydrogen that you produce? And that's what we have to drive down to zero. So all the colors are a little bit of a distraction at the end of the day. They really just take us in a direction that says, my hydrogen's better than your hydrogen, or whatever. When really we should be, I think, looking at it from a portfolio perspective and saying, how do we create hydrogen that accelerates a net zero transition? And how do we do that in a way that gets us to a net zero hydrogen supply across all of those different forms of production at scale and at low cost, so that it can make an impact on the problem?
Right. So if we look at carbon intensity, we can be a lot more precise than if we have these big, I think, David, in a report that you sent me, there's quite a range for the life cycle intensities associated with solar-derived hydrogen versus wind-derived hydrogen versus, all the other sources. So it does seem like it could obscure a big range of products. David, I wanted, and we are going to get to your technology, Mike, because it's very tantalizing. David, so if hydrogen is essentially an energy carrier, not an alternative energy source, we already have an energy carrier. We have electricity. We have a huge electrical grid. We have batteries. We have electric cars. Why not just stick with that? Why pursue hydrogen?
Well, we also, other energy carriers we have are gasoline, diesel, natural gas. They're energy carriers as well. And so one of the problems is that when you combust those, and we do that in every house when we're heating our homes, we do it, and comes out the tailpipe of our car, we have greenhouse gas emissions. And when you have it so distributed, you can't capture it. It's too distributed. You can't possibly make it economic to capture that carbon and prevent it from going into the atmosphere. So it basically just pollutes our atmosphere. So the real attraction of hydrogen is that we can actually distribute this and use it in our cars, use it in perhaps heating our homes, use it in our industrial processes like steel making, et cetera, and not release the greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And I agree with Mike exactly, is that what we need to be focusing on is the carbon intensity associated with making the hydrogen, just as we also have to look very carefully at the carbon intensity associated with making electricity. Electricity and hydrogen are two energy carriers. We can make really dirty electricity, right? And it's like coal-fired electricity, and it's not going to get us to a net zero energy future. What we have to do is focus on the carbon intensity of the hydrogen, but we also need energy carriers that we can use distributed across the country, around the world, that when you consume them, they don't create an environmental problem. And that's where hydrogen fits in. And hydrogen can be made into other energy carriers like ammonia, which in ammonia is a fantastic energy carrier as well. It's got its own problems, but it's really good for actually shipping probably large amounts of hydrogen across the ocean. That's where it probably has its opportunity. And I think right now we have sort of oil tankers moving energy around the world. I would say in 20 years from now, we're going to have an ammonia tankers moving energy around the world. And that's kind of what many of us, I think, on this call are trying to figure out what that looks like and what's the most cost-effective way of getting there, and what kind of what kind of policies and infrastructure do we need to put in to accelerate that transition?
Keegan, so in the Ontario context specifically, OPG has already made amazing progress in reducing our carbon emissions. How do you see hydrogen contributing to taking us further? Where do you see a real role for hydrogen in the near or not so near future?
Yeah, we definitely do. And, I think Ontario and OPG, we have a long history with fighting climate change. So we phased out all of our coal power generator. We were a big coal user in Ontario, and that was one of the biggest climate change initiatives in North America. So we did that, and that's really cleaned up our electricity grid. So it's a lot of nuclear, hydroelectric, solar, wind, a mix of resources. And so after that progress, we really see electricity as a vector for a clean economy. And so it could be through things like electric vehicles or electric heating, but it's also through hydrogen. So our focus is primarily on the green hydrogen or electrolysis produced hydrogen. And it definitely matters how you're producing your electricity. It needs to be in a clean way, and Ontario's grid is largely clean. And so we definitely see a need for hydrogen in the future. And as you increase the demand for clean electricity with EVs and heating, you're going to need more of these clean sources of electricity. And so things like more nuclear, more wind and solar. And the thing about these types of electricity resources is they're inflexible. So the sun shines when it's going to shine, the wind blows when it's going to blow, and nuclear, you don't want to stop it from running. It runs at sort of a constant rate. And so how do you match that to the demand for electricity? And as you try to clean up electricity grids around the world, you're going to have this oversupply of electricity where it's inflexible, not matching the demand at a given moment. And we've seen that in the past recently in Ontario, where we had a lot of surplus electricity that we're either spilling water or sending it to neighbors. And so hydrogen is a great complement to that. When you have too much clean electricity on the system, can you produce hydrogen and store it and then use it in these other use cases like industry and long haul trucking? There's different use cases, and if we're going to get to 2050 net zero targets, there's going to have to be a lot of different solutions. And so we definitely see hydrogen playing a key role in those particular areas. It's not going to be the solution for everything. Light duty vehicles are probably going to be battery electric, but other vehicles that are traveling really far or are very heavy, petrochemicals, steel, those types of industries, they're going to need something to replace fossil fuels, and hydrogen is a great option.
So, Emery, what do we need to make this actually viable? It's obviously, it takes a great deal of investment to build the infrastructure to store this stuff, to to move this stuff around, to retrofit existing, well, to basic. I mean, it's going to cost a lot to get this off the ground. What are the obstacles, and what do you see as some of the solutions to making this happen?
So there are unfortunately many obstacles, but actually there are also many solutions that we know today. So the first obvious obstacle is, of course, cost. So today, switching to hydrogen is mostly an expensive option. And this is actually very nicely tied together with what Keegan has just mentioned about like curtailment of some of these energy sources. So when we look at current hydrogen strategies, if we are only relying on producing hydrogen when we have low cost or zero cost electricity, then we are not able to see the economics working, because you have, let's say, 5 hours, 10 hours of the day when you have zero cost electricity, but you need to run these electrolyzers at higher capacity factors to make use of your investment capital investment. But what we can do is, actually, today we know how to produce low carbon hydrogen, and Mike mentioned many colors of hydrogen, but of course the carbon intensity is the most important one. And if we start the hydrogen economy today, and hydrogen economy is a very loosely used term, so I'm not implying anything, but having hydrogen as another energy vector in the energy system with whatever is available. So natural gas reforming with carbon capture is currently a cheap, cost-effective option that we can start using. And then this can really be helpful to build the infrastructure. So what is really in front of us is building the infrastructure to handle hydrogen. We need to carry hydrogen. This will be in many different forms, like compressed hydrogen trucks, liquefied hydrogen trucks, pipelines, depending on the distance and use cases. All of these options will be part of our transport and distribution network. But these require massive investments. And if today we can focus on the infrastructure piece, then eventually we will have low-cost electrolyzers, low-cost hydrogen from different sources, so on and so forth. And actually, I want to add one quick comment to your question to David about why we need hydrogen. One of the reasons is actually we cannot do the entire decarbonization only with electricity. And there are some sectors that is hard to electrify, or it is very expensive to electrify. One is industry, like Keegan mentioned, iron and steel industry. So if we want to decarbonize these sectors, we need a molecule like hydrogen, which will bring down the cost quite substantially. And also, it's really important to understand that if we are trying to electrify everything, we need enormous expansion of the power grid, both on the generation side as well as on the transmission side. And this is also a very costly option. So we should always think about what are the other available vectors, technologies that is already in place, and how we can use it.
Sorry, just there's a cute comment about us all being polite Canadians here, waiting to take our turn. Yeah, I just want to say, any of you can jump in and elaborate, or contradict an answer from another panelist, so we can.
Well, maybe I could add a comment on it. I agree with Emery's for sure, but one of the things that I think is also important is when you want to move a large amount of energy a long distance, you can actually do it much more cost effectively as hydrogen than as electricity. So, and if you're talking, some of the estimates I've seen are as much as 1/5 the cost. So it costs a lot to build large power lines. You can move a lot of energy in a pipeline, and I think that's one of the things as we try. We're essentially at a stage now, one of the most exciting times I think in the last 120 years, of redesigning our entire energy system around the globe, and it opens up some really interesting and challenging ideas. We need to be able to move energy around. They're energy carriers, and hydrogen is going to play a role both in in long distance moving, but also in storing a large amount of energy. And there's a question in the on the posted question here about energy storage, and certainly some work out of California and other places have identified that for long-term seasonal storage of electricity, hydrogen actually plays a very important role. And but maybe Keegan might have some other comments about various electricity storage opportunities, but so I'd be interested in Keegan's response as well.
Yeah, I think in like the shorter term, the hydrogen is probably more value. Like if there's excess electricity, turn it into hydrogen and then use it to replace in industry or something like that, rather than turning it back to electricity again. So that's probably a further down the line thing where you would go hydrogen, electricity, hydrogen, and back to electricity.
I keep wanting to ask Mike about his technology. Can you tell us a bit about tell us exactly what is Planetary Hydrogen working on right now? What is this
Sure.
this technology that will tick all of the boxes simultaneously?
It's going to do all the things, everything, all at once. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of promise right now, and I mean, it's we're early stage, so as I say, we can make all the claims we'd like. There's no proof yet. So, but essentially, what the technology does in the lab is it really combines two technologies together, and one of them is hydrogen production, green hydrogen production, if we're going to use our colors, or electrolytic hydrogen production. And what we do is that we take a special ingredient and we add that to that electrolytic hydrogen production. And that special ingredient is essentially a mineral, and it allows us to produce this alkalinity out of the back end of the process, in addition to the hydrogen that we produce and the oxygen as well. It's still an electrolytic process. We often don't talk about the oxygen because oxygen's not generally valuable enough to do anything with. So you just put it into the atmosphere, unless you have something local like that needs it, like a sewage treatment facility or an industrial process that needs oxygen or whatever. But generally speaking, it's not a high value product. But the alkalinity is kind of the special sauce of what we're doing. And what we do is we add that alkalinity into ocean chemistry, and that causes the ocean to become kind of the world's largest air contactor for CO2. So one of the challenges with taking carbon dioxide out of the air, we've got sort of three categories of carbon credits we talk about. We talk about, reducing, so reductions. We talk about avoided emissions, but we also have to talk about removals. And so what we're doing is we're actually taking it out of the air directly. And the problem with that kind of process is that typically you need an awful lot of air to get a little bit of carbon dioxide out of the air. Carbon dioxide is only about 400 parts per million right now in the atmosphere, increasing all the time, which is 0.04%, which means that you need, a huge amount of air to get a small amount of carbon dioxide. So we use the ecosystem, we use the ocean, in order to contact our capture chemical, which is basically just a mild base, with CO2, which is a mild acid, and neutralize that into essentially baking soda in ocean chemistry. And that has two effects. That bicarbonate in seawater has the effect of reducing ocean acidification. So our oceans are about 30% too acidic right now. This helps to reduce that in the local area. And the other thing that it does is that it stores it away permanently, so on geological time frames. So carbonates and bicarbonates are stable in ocean chemistry over hundreds of thousands of years. And so that provides us with a sort of a built-in sequestration at the same time as capture. And essentially, this is a natural process. So what it does is it replicates what's called the geochemical cycle of carbon, which, to talk about the nature side of it, you get rain dissolving CO2 out of the air. That forms a very slightly acidified rain that dissolves the surface of rocks, forms that bicarbonate, which flows out to the ocean, and is the reason why there's about 38,000 gigatons or 38,000 billion tons of CO2 stored in our oceans in the ocean chemistry. And so it's a really interesting sort of acceleration of a natural process with hydrogen as a bit of a byproduct, if you will, of the process.
Okay, so big picture, and correct me if I have this incorrect. Yeah. You are removing carbon from the atmosphere, locking it away in the oceans. In the process, deacidifying the oceans.
Yep.
And
in a local area. Yeah.
In a
Oceans
local area.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you described it as giving the ocean an antacid, and you would
Yep.
need a lot of antacid to deacidify what we've acidified. And also in the process producing hydrogen, which
Correct.
can be used for fuel.
That's right.
So when will this work? Where are we at? You said this is early days. How far along are you?
Yeah, so we've demonstrated in the lab, and we're building a demonstration plant right now. So the demonstration plant in Eastern Canada should be up and running by the end of 2022. So that's what we're doing. And for us, when it plays into Canada's and the general hydrogen strategy, and maybe just extending on from what we were talking about earlier, and talking about carbon intensity of hydrogen, what the net effect of all of this is, we get hydrogen with a negative carbon intensity. So you end up with, sort of, if I take a carbon intensity score of, say, hydrogen from a gray hydrogen source, like just natural gas, and say that's 100 grams of CO2 per megajoule as a sort of number, 100. Ours is like negative 250 to negative 330, depending on how efficient we're able to make the process in the long term. Which means that you can essentially say, hey, if I take 2/3 or 3/4 of my hydrogen from, gray hydrogen, which is very high scale, very, very cheap, and also dirty, and, 1/3 to 1/4 of it from planetary hydrogen, well, then I've got net zero carbon intensity in the process. And we end up with a system that's like super scalable, super cheap for this zero carbon hydrogen at the end of the day. If we go to blue hydrogen, we go even further, right? So we get this sort of idea that we've got, 5 to 10% of the carbon left over in the blue hydrogen. If our system matches up with that, well, we only have to do a very small amount of planetary hydrogen in the supply in order to get to net zero. And I think that's, when I look at Canada's national hydrogen strategy and how it focuses on carbon intensity and the ability to take, I think, a lot of the innovation and the progress that Canada's already made on hydrogen to the world, I see it as a key sort of lever to be able to really leverage, Canada's advantages in that way.
So John Bailey has a question that I think probably a lot of people have when they first hear about, or not even when they first hear about it, when they learn about hydrogen fuel in general. So John wants to know, can someone speak to safety and other barriers to adoption of hydrogen? Specifically, one of the barriers in the Boston area has been restricting access of hydrogen trucks to tunnels. How have you overcome the various adoption barriers? So I think everybody, well, not everybody, a lot of people think of Hindenburg when they hear about things like hydrogen powered planes. This is a very flammable and pressurized gas. There are definitely safety considerations. Does anyone want to jump in and answer John's question? I can pick on you if not.
I can start. I think, of course, this is a important consideration, but also any other fuel is also flammable and dangerous. So it is, I think hydrogen, because of the Hindenburg, we have a very bad image that everybody thinks about immediately. But if you think about like natural gas blow-ups, and if you're in Boston area, you hear about these every year, a couple of houses basically burn to the ground because of the natural gas explosion, so on and so forth. So any gas is dangerous, any fuel is dangerous, but there are engineering solutions, so we can handle it. Actually, hydrogen is not new to the energy system. So today, there is huge amount of hydrogen has been used in petrochemical industry, as other feedstock for ammonia production, fertilizer production. And there are massive storage systems, like in Texas area, there are more than 1,000 miles of hydrogen pipelines. In California, 600 miles of hydrogen pipelines. So this is not something completely new. But of course, we need to be very careful. We had a hydrogen symposium at MIT Energy Initiative last year, or I think 2 years ago. Because of the COVID, I skipped 1 year. During that conference, we had a speaker from Toyota, and Toyota is one of the first ones to build the hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. And we had the exact same question from the audience, and his response was, if there is a gunshot, the safest place you can be is behind the hydrogen gas tank in one of our vehicles. So I think there is solutions, and people are developing solutions to handle hydrogen safely. But this tunnel issue with Boston is true, and also this is not only for hydrogen trucks but also for hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. And currently, if you are in Boston area and if you want to actually drive a hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles, you cannot use the tunnels. But again, with regulations and probably testing, this is something it can be overcome.
What exactly is the issue with tunnels specifically?
So there are, as you know, many tunnels in Boston, and currently the regulations do not allow you to go under the tunnels if you are driving a hydrogen fuel cell electric car, or if you are a hydrogen truck.
Because so if it catches fire, you get like a blowtorch coming at it. Like, what is the particular?
So probably, yeah. So you will get stuck with a burning vehicle there, and probably that's the issue. But also there's one advantage of hydrogen is very small, and in case of leak for pipelines, for example, hydrogen directly goes to the air very quickly before actually you can achieve the right composition of air and hydrogen to have a immediate flame. But in the case of natural gas is heavier, so it sticks in the air, and it can get burned quickly and more dangerously. So this is something that shows actually hydrogen can even be safer than natural gas, especially if we handle the right way.
Because in an open area would float away as it burns,
exactly,
as opposed to, yeah, okay,
yeah,
or gasoline, which would be liquid and hanging around and continue to catch fire. So David, how far away? You're working hard on making this transition happen in Canada. Are we going to be seeing, hydrogen fueling stations all over the country next year? Like when are we talking about?
Well, maybe a couple of years, but we hope to have our first fueling station for heavy trucks in Edmonton by the end of this year. And we're putting some heavy trucks on the road. These are by early mid 2022. These will be 63.5 metric ton trucks. These 140,000 pounds. Carrying freight between Edmonton and Calgary, 700 kilometers between refueling. So they're carrying a lot. So these are demonstrating the scale. Canadian Pacific is a railway company that's centered in Calgary. They've already taken a switcher train. They've pulled the diesel engine out of it, a diesel electric train. They're putting fuel cells in it now and batteries. And by this time next year, they're telling me it'll be on the tracks in Alberta running on hydrogen. So what we're seeing is a lot of movement. We can make hydrogen pretty inexpensively. Blue hydrogen is what the focus is at this time in Alberta, because we have very holy rocks here. We've got ability to store lots of the carbon dioxide that comes off from natural gas. And we have also very inexpensive natural gas. We're kind of stranded away from natural gas markets, a long way away. And so there's a possibility of using that resource and creating hydrogen that will drive the economy. The focus we have in Alberta is and actually across Canada, the national strategy identifies the importance of hubs, of building around concentrated areas where you can make hydrogen at significant quantities with a relatively low cost. And right nearby, you have hydrogen demand for maybe transport or steel making, or maybe for space heating, but a significant supply and demand that you can connect together really efficiently, and we can get to scale where the economics will actually work without ongoing public investment. So that's what I think the key part of the Canadian strategy is these hubs where we build to scale quickly.
We have another question from Dave. Can hydrogen be used in conventional internal combustion or gas turbine engines? What would the drawbacks be? I don't know if there's someone who wants to.
So I can certainly, I'd be happy to comment on that. We're actually involved in a few projects. Certainly you can put hydrogen into conventional engines. It doesn't work very well as pure hydrogen. What seems to work well is when you have a diesel engine, for a large diesel engine, where you inject hydrogen in, and the hydrogen molecules, because it's a very small molecule, it diffuses more quickly. It actually, even at small concentrations, 5% or something in that range of the energy content of the engine, it actually improves the combustion of the diesel fuel. So you get a lot less particulate emission. You get a dramatic reduction, about 95% reduction in particulate emissions from a diesel engine. And you can actually decrease the amount of diesel fuel you use. There are a number of companies around the world that are starting to look at this as a bridge technology to a hydrogen economy, where we can inject hydrogen into diesel engines, decarbonize the diesel system, and start to build out fueling stations. What's attractive about this technology is that if the company, is the person driving the truck gets out of the range of where there's a hydrogen fueling station, doesn't matter. The vehicle just goes back to a diesel engine. But as soon as they can reload with diesel, they're going to have lower emissions. And we're estimating 30 to 40% reduction in emissions with technologies around today.
So we might be seeing hybrid vehicles for a while before we
I would say
pure.
I wouldn't call them hybrid, I'd call them dual fuel. Right?
Okay.
The dual fuel. It's not really a hybrid, it's still the one engine, but it's really got two fuels. It's got a diesel and a hydrogen as a second fuel.
So
I actually wanted to, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, and in the power generation context, it can also be used. So we have, natural gas turbines that are used for peaking generation, and so without much change, we can mix in, lower concentrations of hydrogen, sort of up to 15%, that type of range, with the natural gas, and still run it in the same turbines. And then we also have, there's pilots in Ontario where people are blending hydrogen into natural gas pipelines for all consumers. So, as long as you're not getting too high in the concentration, they can be used in furnaces and, other home appliances. So there are definitely sort of interim steps without going all the way.
I want to come back to Dave's earlier question. David, you touched on it briefly, but Dave was asking about how green hydrogen compares with other methods of grid energy storage in terms of cost and feasibility. Emery, I feel like you've written about the cost issue. If you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, the use case of hydrogen is really not for one sector specific, and that makes a huge difference. So if you are only looking at using hydrogen for energy storage, it's not economical. And currently at MIT, we are under completion of Future of Energy Storage study, and I'm the lead for the hydrogen chapter, and we've looked at long duration hydrogen storage, others for energy storage, and if you are only using as an energy storage option, it's not economical. But we need to understand that once you have hydrogen in the system, you can use for multiple applications, and that is the key here. That's why we really need to understand the system integration piece of hydrogen, not only for specific use case. And you can do this for any sector. So if we are only looking at light duty vehicles, hydrogen is not economical. If you are only looking for decarbonizing some energy sectors, it's not economical. But once you have this multiple end users and you share the cost of infrastructure production for the entire supply chain, the picture changes quite dramatically. Having said that, we have recently submitted a paper on California, and we looked at converting gas peaking plant to hydrogen and compared this conversion with using lithium-ion batteries. And for almost 50% of the locations, given the same profile, actually hydrogen is more economical than other energy storage options, even under very high cost scenarios. So this also shows that actually other energy storage options are also not economical yet, especially given the very low cost of natural gas. But I am very confident that we will see hydrogen in the energy system, and energy storage will be one of the applications for sure.
David, you've written about big picture that there's a bit of a vicious cycle where we're not going to get low cost supply until we have a great deal of demand, but we're not going to have a great deal of demand until there's low cost supply. How do you break out of that? It sounds like we already have some demand and some relatively affordable supply in some areas, but
Indeed. Well, I think it's going to depend on where you are and what resources you have, but certainly we already make a lot of hydrogen, as we've talked about. We use it to make fertilizer, et cetera. So one way of breaking that vicious cycle and maybe converting it into a virtuous cycle, if you like, is to piggyback on some of our existing industrial hydrogen production, getting that hydrogen production to go to blue hydrogen, so that we're capturing the CO2. That's going to help to reduce the carbon footprint of making fossil fuels, but also making fertilizers, et cetera. But we can take then a pipeline off of those companies and feed it into fuel markets. And we can start to build demand for the fuel in those regions. Hydrogen's a gas, of course, and unlike a liquid fuel, it's a lot more expensive to move around. It's a lot more expensive to store, unless you do it at really large scale. Unless we get to this kind of scale like Emery was talking about, where we're actually, getting to a scale that is serving many different sectors, transportation, steel making, home heating, some industrial uses. Then the economics, we can get to an economics where it works. So what we're trying to do is to go to scale rapidly in certain targeted areas we call nodes, then start connecting the nodes together and create corridors. And then using a pipeline and other infrastructure, we can sort of grow like a spider web out across North America and around the world. And a lot of this, we can possibly piggyback and repurpose some of our existing infrastructure, our natural gas pipelines, et cetera, that could be repurposed for hydrogen. So that's, I think we're still in the development stage of how to do it, and the kind of work that Emery's been doing, I think, is really important to start to think at that systems level about what could work economically, and then how do we get there in the most cost-effective way.
I just noticed I've been missing the comments in the chat, which is distinct from the Q&A, but you can continue to leave questions in either. Maybe actually we'll go to Suresh's first, because Brad was referring to an earlier point, which we can come back to. Suresh says, you talked about shipping ammonia derived from hydrogen. Is there an easy path from green hydrogen to green ammonia? Where does that stand in terms of commercial scale? That was you, David, I believe, talking about.
Well, I could comment.
Shipping ammonia.
There's some really exciting work being done in Saudi Arabia, where they have very large solar installation. They're converting the solar to electricity, getting electricity, of course, cheap electricity, making hydrogen, and then making ammonia. And it's a Haber-Bosch process, essentially. It's a similar process. There's a few different technologies that are becoming forward. The one that's the most mature now is the Haber-Bosch, where you basically take nitrogen from the atmosphere and hydrogen, you put it together at high temperature with a catalyst, and you get ammonia. It's a very efficient process, and then you can move the ammonia. And I think there are some other technologies. Maybe others could comment on that are coming forward. I'm not convinced they're fully commercial yet.
Mike, will you be developing carbon negative ammonia next?
I mean, we're going to start with hydrogen, and then the deployment scenario for the technology is going to determine the use of the hydrogen. But I will add to this a little bit and say that I think that over focusing on hydrogen itself as a primary energy carrier, as just hydrogen, is probably only a part of the story. And it's important to think about these things like ammonia, methanol, even biofuels. I think, I don't remember whether it was Emery or David that mentioned biofuels at the start, but fully half of the hydrogen produced today, the gray hydrogen primarily that's produced today, is used to refine fossil fuels in some capacity or another, either to produce plastics or to, essentially act like a crowbar on long chain crude molecules and turn them into things like gasoline and diesel and aviation fuel. But what's interesting about biofuels in particular is that they need 4 to 5 times, depending on the biofuel source, but 4 to 5 times as much hydrogen to refine them as a fossil fuel does. And that's because there's a lot of oxygen in those molecules from biological sources, and they have to be, that oxygen has to come out, and so you need to use the hydrogen in order to pull the oxygen out, essentially. So there's actually a really interesting opportunity to grow green and blue and negative emissions hydrogen into the really hard to decarbonize areas, right? There's a lot of interesting stuff going on right now in the world around hydrogen powered flight, for example. Airbus is talking about that right now. We're talking about that with there's a few really interesting companies that are doing hydrogen powered flight initiatives. But the easiest solution to decarbonizing flight would be to just make carbon neutral or carbon negative jet fuel, and that wouldn't require any infrastructure change, and would be something that we could kind of just do. And jet fuel is about 2% of the climate problem right now, so it would have a big impact. And hydrogen, clean hydrogen of various different sources can be something like that. So that's something we're definitely interested in from a negative hydrogen perspective, because if you take something like Midwest corn or canola, beef tallow, something like that, and you produce an aviation fuel using hydrogen to produce that aviation fuel from the biological source, and you use our hydrogen, you can actually end up having a carbon negative jet fuel. And I think that's kind of neat, right? You can get on a plane and you could say, hey, like this plane, every mile it flies, we actually take carbon out of the air. That's pretty cool. So, those are the kinds of use cases that we think, again, focusing on low and negative carbon intensity hydrogen can start to enable.
Yeah, I think clearly this panel is, skewed towards team hydrogen, but we should be aware that it's only part of the solution. How important a part is it? Again, bearing in mind that we have a very pro hydrogen group of people here. We have these targets that we've set to reach net zero by 2050. OPG is aiming for even sooner than that. How important is hydrogen to getting us to those targets? Or can we maybe do it without hydrogen?
Can't do it without hydrogen. You can't. I mean, it's hydrogen, such like we're talking about, it's such an integral part of our energy system today. It's not so much about whether we're going to get there without hydrogen. It's whether we're going to have clean enough hydrogen to get us there. And I think that's a big part of it. Anyway, I'll let David and Emery, because they probably actually analyze these things, and I'm just an entrepreneur. But that's what I think.
Yeah, actually, you can. So you don't need hydrogen, but hydrogen is an effective, efficient way of getting there. One crazy option we can think of: let's continue burning fossil resources and then have direct air capture everywhere, and then capture all the CO2 that we are emitting. We can do this, right? So at scale, but this requires massive scale, and it will be at least 100 times more expensive than going through other paths. So I think we are trying to find really the cost optimal solution where we can continue using some of the infrastructure, benefiting, and also we need to understand that we have time pressure. So if we are late by 10 years, then we don't know what will be the consequence of the climate change, or it will be quite devastating, right? So, and if we continue using electricity and support it with hydrogen, we know we can get it very quickly, efficiently, and cost effectively. So this is why we need hydrogen. But if you don't want to use it, you can do it.
Very fair answer. Yeah. David, you seem like you are itching to say something.
I was just going to agree. I mean, you can pay a lot more. What I think the world wants is for the researchers and the scientists, the entrepreneurs, to find the least cost, the low cost solution to this. And I think that hydrogen is certainly part of that. In the Canadian strategy, you've talked about the magnitude. They're talking about 30% of primary energy by 2050. And I think that's a reasonable number. That is, if you convert that to tons of hydrogen per day. Across Canada today, we're producing about 8,000 tons of hydrogen per day. That's used as an industrial feedstock. For a fuel market that they talked about in the Canadian hydrogen strategy, it's about 55,000 tons of hydrogen per day. would be the fuel market. So it's a significant increase, right, in the amount of hydrogen we produce. But the hydrogen would not, that hydrogen would be becoming an energy carrier rather than an industrial feedstock.
Right, and again, ultimately the goal is to get the cleanest hydrogen as our energy carrier.
Cleanest hydrogen, lowest cost.
If it could, lowest cost, if it can de-acidify our oceans also at the same time, that would be fantastic. What
I'd love
kind
to
of
learn more?
Yeah, how scalable? How much antacid can you produce? Right? Do you think, Mike?
Well, like
Is
I
it
said,
too soon to say?
no, I mean, it's you can do anything with infinite money and time, right? So, but like this is a linearly scalable solution. So it's the same kind of solution that is in wide scale use in industry, in the chemical industry today. So it's nothing crazy in terms of the scale up of this. It's fairly well known as to how it scales. We think that because when we look at scalability limits, it's not the amount of antacid we can produce, it's really more, how much of it can we put into the ocean in one place. And that's really the key thing. So we're embarking on, a fairly extensive oceans research study with Dalhousie University out here around safety and effectiveness and all these kinds of things. But really, like the ocean has so much carbon in it that if you could sort of wave a magic wand to just distribute antacid across it evenly across the entire ocean, 71% of the Earth's surface, then the capacity for carbon storage there is almost infinite, at least in the context of our carbon problem. Give you a sense of it, if you took every molecule of CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it into the oceans using our process, you'd only increase the amount of carbon in the ocean by about 2%. So there's just like a huge amount of capacity there. And so we don't think it's out of range to be saying, look, like every year starting in 2035, our technology is taking a gigaton out of the atmosphere. That's where we want to be. So yeah, we think it's pretty scalable.
Anand is asking why we're not talking about nuclear, which is a very elegant and cost-effective and probably the most time-sensitive solution. So hydrogen, not an alternative energy source, but an energy carrier. But certainly, I think someone mentioned some people call it, when we use nuclear energy to produce hydrogen, some people call it yellow hydrogen. If you're nuclear wary.
That's changing, because I mean the EU very recently actually changed the taxonomy to call nuclear a renewable energy source. So now you could sort of call nuclear green. But at the time it was like nuclear was not counted as renewable energy in Europe until very recently, and that meant that you had to call it something else. But just to comment on nuclear, and maybe I'll hand off to Keegan because nuclear better than anybody. But I think nuclear is just an awesome pairing with hydrogen. I think there's a really great match there in terms of how it works, and for a whole variety of reasons. But Keegan, maybe you probably have a little bit more detail on it than I do.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we've all been kind of mentioning, there's a lot of different solutions are needed here. We have a big problem. It's not one solution, and definitely, in most jurisdictions, electricity is one of the highest emitting sectors. It's not in Ontario, it's actually one of the lowest emitting, but in most jurisdictions. And so nuclear is a key first step, to help decarbonize the electricity system. And then, as you increase demand, as I was sort of talking about before, nuclear is very inflexible and doesn't match demand for electricity. So you can produce hydrogen. So it is very complementary, as Mike was alluding to. And so I think definitely nuclear is a key solution for cleaning up the electricity sector. Battery electric vehicles, key for the transportation sector, as well as hydrogen and some of those longer haul heavy duty fleets. And then certainly in industry, hydrogen is going to be another key sort of pathway to cleaning up that industry.
We actually have a couple more questions. Valerie, hi, I didn't know you were here. Hello. Is asking, what is the US doing on hydrogen? Any parallel thinking to Canada's at the national level? Emre, I feel like you might be best positioned to answer that.
Yeah, so US also has a hydrogen strategy, and like in a similar tone. So there are a lot of research going on right now. But like my perspective is for US, probably the starting point will be blue hydrogen, as probably in Canada it will be also. like natural gas reforming with carbon capture. And the first sectors to go after will be industry, like replacing existing like industry hydrogen with lower carbon options, heavy duty vehicles, and also there are some projects about residential heating, especially in the New England area. Also some projects about blending natural gas into pipelines for gas turbines, which is what Keegan mentioned about we can also use for the electricity production with natural gas. So I think there is a growing interest, and it's not as enthusiastic as we see in Europe, especially in Germany, but it's definitely increasing. So relative to 2 years ago, there's definitely much more talking about hydrogen. But actually, when we look at Biden's plan, infrastructure plan, unfortunately, we don't have too much about hydrogen. It's more on the electrification side. So I really wish to see some elements about hydrogen infrastructure there. There are some about clean fuels, but like given the size of the issue, it is minuscule.
Was there some investment under Bush, wasn't there? I believe like a significant.
Yeah, in 2008, Bush really wanted to have hydrogen economy more on the transportation side. So using hydrogen to decarbonize transportation. But that didn't really follow very well because it was, again, very focused on transportation. So I think the key on hydrogen is really this systems view. But actually, since we are on the systems view part, I've seen many criticism in the Q&A as chat that we are only speaking about hydrogen. And the reason is because this is a hydrogen webinar and panel. But of course, hydrogen is only one of the solutions. We need a portfolio of solutions. And in addition to what we've been discussed, carbon capture is another key technology that we will be using massively if we want to achieve our climate targets. But not to derail the conversation from hydrogen, I think nobody is focusing on other pieces, but nobody, I think, in this panel is saying that hydrogen is the only solution. It's one of the solutions.
But to bring us back to the hydrogen solution, Dave has another question, which is basically how can people be persuaded that hydrogen provides a safe and an exciting energy future worth spending big infrastructure dollars on? Is this something that will need government investment, or do you think this will simply happen from current economic forces? It's a really good question. David, I feel like you're the one who's working on this very problem.
Yeah, no, I think we need to start to deploy and demonstrate. I think it has to be shown by demonstration. We have to start putting hydrogen, and this is happening already in Ontario. They're looking at putting hydrogen into natural gas systems and distribution. There are a number of companies that we've been talking to that are starting to try out hydrogen in gas turbines and power generation and other applications. The hydrogen into trucking and trains, hydrogen fueling stations being deployed across Canada. I think hydrogen bus fleets, we're working, and I know there's a group in Mississauga as well as a group in Edmonton that we're working with that are trying to put hydrogen fuel cell buses on the road. I think the next few years, we're going to see a lot of demonstrations. And hopefully they will go smoothly and well and enthusiastic support. And that will build, I think, interest, knowledge, and confidence in this as being a key pillar in moving forward. So I think it's, we've just got to start doing it, but we also need to, we also need to start talking to, for example, First Nations. We're going to need to be moving hydrogen across in pipelines. We're going to have to talk to Canadians about a pipeline infrastructure and maybe repurposing some existing pipelines, but even creating some new pipelines. So we need to start having conversations about, try to develop a shared vision for a net zero energy future that is really at the systems level. The kind of stuff that Emery's doing is, to look at the whole value, the whole system, the whole value chain, and start bringing the level of understanding and education up among Canadians, but also to understand what they want, in terms of moving to a net zero energy future. And
I would just add to David's point, we've talked a bit about this the vicious cycle and chicken and egg type problem. And so for me, that screams for a role for government, right? How do you there's no demand, so people don't want to supply. And so I think there's a role for government, and the Canadian federal government showing great leadership with the hydrogen strategy and some of the investments that they're talking about making. And there's also a role for business. So, at OPG, we're talking about doing some of these demonstration projects to be a catalyst for the industry in Ontario and get it moving, because it's going to take action from a lot of different parties working together to get the hydrogen economy off the ground and scale it up to somewhere where it's viable and it can be a pathway to that net zero world.
Yeah, I totally support what both David and Keegan said. I think that one of the things I'd add to it is that governments are playing a really critical role when it comes down to things like fuel standards and carbon crediting in general. And of course, that's something that's near and dear to our hearts. But in general, I think what we're seeing is that even I read a study the other day that was saying that you could see at scale electrolyzers really coming down in cost to by 40 to 60% in terms of capital cost over the next few years if we get wide scale deployment. And very, very similar to what we saw in wind and solar in terms of the rapidly dropping cost curves there through both like learning rate and economies of scale and increased technology investment, motivated by things like production tax credits and things like that. I think in the hydrogen market, we're going to see very similar things. And so, with the Canada Clean Fuel Standard, with the LCFS in California, with the ones that are coming up in Washington, Oregon, and all kinds of other states on fuel standards, things like 45Q and Canada's newly announced ITC on carbon, there's some really interesting things that will sort of subsidize hydrogen in a way until those cost curves really start to become apparent, right? And when we get to that point where those cost curves come down, so those kinds of supports can start to disappear and still have sort of really strong economics around things. Right now, I was just looking at the hydrogen market in terms of the scale of green hydrogen or electrolytic hydrogen in general. It's really still very much like a bespoke industry, right? Like it's not like cars where you've got massive scale of production of electrolyzers happening anywhere. It's really just a couple of small companies that are doing relatively small runs of electrolyzer technology. In the future, if we can get there, and I've heard predictions of between hydrogen being between 1.5 trillion from the IEA by 2050 to like I saw one the other day was like $11.7 trillion market by 2050, which I don't really believe, but like maybe, fingers crossed. But if that happens, the scale of that means that the unit costs are just going to go through the floor. And so I think that government supports can help to bridge that divide.
So we've talked a lot about the different kinds of hydrogen and how it matters what kind of hydrogen we're using. Is it now we're currently using most of our hydrogen is so-called gray hydrogen produced with fossil fuels. Is it a plausible scenario that we build this infrastructure and then we use it to mainly distribute gray hydrogen? Should I be worried about that? That this will be just another way to deliver to people fossil fuel energy that appears cleaner? Is that a real concern, or is this inevitably going to bring in a flood of green and blue hydrogen once we have the infrastructure going?
I think that's where.
Is that too cynical? I don't know.
No, I think Mike talked about the importance of having governments at standards and fuel standards, et cetera. And I don't think. Personally, I don't think if we're going to do that, we might as well just keep burning the fossil fuels we have now, right? And I think the drive for this is in large part to show very significant transformations that will address the climate change problem in a serious way. So, and I think that the environmental groups, the general public across Canada, around the world, won't stand for that. So,
but even if we are using with gray hydrogen,
there is an improvement.
It has some advantages because
30%.
So one point that David made earlier is actually if you are centralizing your CO2 emitting facilities Actually, it's easier to capture, right? So for, let's say, instead of using gas turbines with natural gas, you are using gray hydrogen to supply hydrogen to gas turbines. So you are only emitting CO2 from one massive steam methane reforming unit. If eventually you want to capture, it's much easier to deploy other than capturing from 10, 20 gas turbine units. Similarly, think about vehicles. So there is no way you can capture carbon from all passenger vehicles, but if they are burning hydrogen, then you don't have CO2 coming from tailpipe. Your only emission source is centralized. And what we see is even under very low carbon tax, you need to switch to reforming with carbon capture or renewable electricity plus electrolysis. So one of the government levers is, of course, having a price on carbon. And once we have it in place, and if it is high enough, then nobody will use gray hydrogen.
Thank you. That's a, yeah, it'll be great also for city dwellers such as myself. Suddenly the air will be much cleaner locally. But yes, we're not capturing the carbon off of people's tailpipes right now at all. So there's opportunity there. Brad I'm not sure I follow. Hydrogen at 30% primary energy in 2050 equals 5 million tons hydrogen per day versus 8,000 tons per day now. Okay, right. So we need to amp up production quite a bit. How much will be renewable electrolytic versus carbon capture and storage hydrogen? I'm not sure I totally follow. I don't know if
yeah, blue versus green.
Okay, great. Who wants to? David, you look like you're.
I can comment on it. I think the Canadian strategy identifies and says, look, because of the cost difference and the fact that you can get to scale very quickly with blue hydrogen. And I think eventually we're going to see a more and more shift to green hydrogen. But I think in the next 20 to 30 years, I think the economics and the sheer scale and magnitude of the challenge it means that we're probably going to see more blue hydrogen in the overall hydrogen mix or at least in Canada. We're kind of a northern country. Our solar resources are pretty damn good in the summer, but pretty lousy in the winter. And, and we also have a huge seasonal swing in when our energy requirements are. For space heating, for example, a lot more demand for energy in the winter than in the summer. And, there's all these annual swings. And so my sense is we're going to see blue hydrogen is probably going to be the more dominant. But I think green hydrogen with the dropping of electrolyzer prices, with the possibility of, say, if nuclear could come on as a small modular reactors and bring the price down, it's really about the price of electricity to do it. So I think we're going to see a lot of interesting innovations. Carbon pricing is going to be a really important factor. We're very close now, within the next few years, to basically having the carbon price be made more economically for companies making hydrogen to make it blue hydrogen. And I could see that within 3 or 4 years. It's the obvious decision. So I don't know. Those are the things that's going to drive towards blue. I think green is going to be a really important, and the new planetary hydrogen technology is very exciting. I'd love to learn a lot more about it and know the nitty gritty techno-economics, but environmental assessments. But there's a lot of innovation going on now, and pretty exciting times.
And I would just add to David, I think it's a bit jurisdictional specific as well. So, Alberta has the right situation for blue hydrogen, the right rocks, the source of natural gas, where, somewhere like Ontario has a clean electricity system, lots of nuclear, other provinces have tons of electricity. So you see electrolysis happening in Quebec already. So there's a bit of a jurisdictional, maybe one thing's right for one area and another's right for another.
We just have a few minutes left, and thank you for that answer, David. My brain caught up to parsing the sentences right as we're speaking, so it actually makes total sense. So in just the last few minutes, I wanted to ask you, open question, I guess, is there anything else that you think is important for people to understand about our hydrogen future, our hydrogen present, that we didn't get to cover? We've talked about safety, we've talked about the types of hydrogen, whether we're going to have Hindenburgs in the sky. We talked about team electricity versus team hydrogen being compatible with one another, potentially. Is there anything else that?
I think one thing we haven't really touched upon is the international network of hydrogen supply, exports and imports. So this is not a local issue. So, and it's not only bounded by countries either. So I think there will be a lot of exports, imports, like any other energy carriers, especially from renewable resource rich areas to renewable resource poor areas, and or cities where we have huge population density and we don't have enough space to generate electricity or generate hydrogen, so on and so forth. And I think this will become a real market. So like LNG today, probably we will be seeing liquefied hydrogen ships or ammonia ships that goes from North Africa to Europe, Canada to Europe. Japan is definitely a huge market which is really looking at how they can bring hydrogen from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and potentially Canada. So I think this is another area that we haven't talked today, but this will be very, very important. So the international trade of hydrogen, clean, low carbon hydrogen.
Yeah, who do we see as being primed to be our big green hydrogen exporters? Are there any leading contenders for that? Is Canada the place?
Not green hydrogen, but low carbon hydrogen. One place that is currently very in the spotlight is Australia, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, North Africa. And also when I read the hydrogen strategy of Canada, I think Canada is one of the candidates.
And certainly it's a major focus, as you might imagine, in Alberta, northern BC and southern Saskatchewan as an area that could be a major provider of that blue hydrogen. Quebec is very active in looking at markets in Germany, so for exporting hydrogen to Germany. And I think there might be some opportunities for Ontario too there, and perhaps, but I think that would be exciting. And certainly Newfoundland, when they come on in a few years with their new hydro capability, and when they get back Churchill Falls in 2041, I suspect we could be looking. They're going to be looking for export markets. So, and for not only electricity but for hydrogen. And so I don't know. I think you're going to see Canada has incredibly large resources compared to our population, and I think that there's a possibility that it will be a player as an exporter of zero emission hydrogen.
I think we also have an opportunity, and we talk about this in the strategy as well. I see that an opportunity to export the technology around it as well. And there's so much innovation happening in hydrogen right now because everybody sees it as not only a huge market in the future, but also one that is so heavily supported by net zero initiatives around the world. I mean, probably actually more heavily supported in Europe than it is here in Canada. But one of the advantages that I think Canada has, and actually one of the reasons we as a startup are running our company here with American, originally American technology, is the supports for early stage technology here are amazing. And I think we'll see a lot of net zero technology, and in that a lot of hydrogen technology being exported from Canada around the world as well.
Well, we're just about out of time. I did want to mention Brad's comment before I hand it over to Katya, just correcting us that apparently you can drive a fuel cell car through the tunnels in Boston now, that the rule had been reversed. Not sure about bulk transport. And also Bradshaw is president of Hydrogen Energy Center. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in case people are just watching the recording and can't see the chat. And I think that's it. Katya, thank you so much to all of our panelists. It was lovely talking to all of you, and I've learned a lot. So thank you for being here today.
I just wanted to close it out by saying thank you to all of you, especially you, Ella. I know you did some reading on this topic, and you did this flawlessly. This is amazing. Also, you know, I know Zoom fatigue is real, so thank you to our audience for sticking around. You know, we had nearly everyone stay, which is amazing. So thank you for sticking around. Thank you for making this an active conversation. I think the whole purpose of this was to see where sort of we can build bridges here in Boston and what's going on in Canada, and I hope that happens. And again, I encourage everyone, if you didn't take my advice before, to stick your LinkedIn in the chat. You know, so you can, this is the problem with no in-person events. You don't get to, you know, exchange business cards. So that's my best thought on that. So, you know, hopefully you all can exchange some meaningful conversations after this. And Andrew, again, thank you so much. We love working with the Canadian Consulate and all your politeness. And we appreciate it. Andrew, I don't know if you want to say a few words to close.
No, likewise, I appreciate the partnership with MyTF, and thanks everybody for sticking around. This has been fantastic, and our doors are always open here to continue the conversation. So please feel free to reach out if there's anything we can help with.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Take good care.
Thank you so much.